This happened to my dad when he was just a kid, and although he never openly admitted it, I think it left a deep mark on him. He was about 10 years old, home alone for some reason, sitting in the living room watching TV. It was the only TV in the house, an old, clunky thing that frequently malfunctioned. Suddenly, the screen just went black. My dad, thinking it was another one of those common glitches, got up to turn it back on. But then it happened again. The TV shut off by itself. Frustrated, he got up and turned it on again. He repeated this a couple more times, getting more annoyed each time before he decided to look for the remote control, thinking it might be malfunctioning or stuck. He started checking around the couch, looking behind the cushions. When he looked behind one of the couches, he was greeted by a sight that still haunts him to this day. A man crouching in the corner, holding the remote. The man had long, messy hair and a crazed look in his eyes. He stared at my dad with a twisted smile that sent a shiver down his spine. My dad didn't think twice. He bolted out the front door, screaming at the top of his lungs. He ran straight to his neighbor's house, where they called the police. When the police arrived, the man was still there, calmly sitting in the living room as if he belonged there. They arrested him on the spot. My dad always assumed the man was either homeless or mentally unstable, but to this day, the thought of that crazed smile in the dark corner of the living room still gives him chills. It's a story that I can't even imagine experiencing without feeling deeply disturbed. One of my friends once told me a story that happened to her when she was around 8 or 9 years old. She lived with her single mom, who worked long hours and usually came home late on weekdays. On this particular day, she was walking home from school, as usual, pulling out her key to let herself into the house. But just as she was about to unlock the door, it suddenly opened. Her mom stood there, dressed in a bathrobe, looking unusually serious. Instead of greeting her, her mom's eyes widened as she looked past her daughter and demanded, "Who are you?" Confused, my friend turned around to see a man in a long coat hurrying down the path and disappearing down the street. Her mom had come home early that day because she was sick, and as they realized later, her unexpected presence might have saved her daughter from something terrible. To this day, my friend shudders when she thinks about what might have happened if her mom hadn't been there. Jacob's childhood was rough, mostly because of his mother's issues with addiction. His father wasn't perfect either, but his biggest flaw was being with her. One night, Jacob and his dad were asleep when they were jolted awake by a series of loud bangs, scratching noises, and the sound of furniture being moved around, all coming from Jacob's mother's room. His dad, sensing something was wrong, leaped out of bed and raced down the hall, pounding on the door. When she opened it, she was furious, yelling at him for waking her up, but Jacob's dad was scared, terrified even. The window in her room was wide open. The TV had been dragged across the room, still plugged in, but facing the outside, as if someone had been trying to take it through the window. His father's first instinct was to think that Jacob's mother was back on something, but something about the situation fell off. He shut the window, grabbed a baseball bat for protection, and barricaded her room from the outside. He made her sleep in the living room that night while he stayed awake, guarding the house. At around 5 a.m., still dark outside, Jacob's father woke him up. They went into the kitchen where Jacob's mother was already sitting. A few minutes later, Jacob's dad joined them, looking wide-eyed and on edge. He motioned for them to be quiet, holding a finger to his lips. Then, they heard it, a shuffling sound on the roof, as if something or someone was moving from edge to edge. Jacob's dad gripped the bat tightly as they sat together, paralyzed with fear, listening to the sounds above them. Eventually, the noises stopped, but the tension in the room was palpable. They decided to leave the house and called Jacob's grandmother, asking if they could stay with her for a while. She agreed and promised to come pick them up. As they waited, Jacob sat on the couch in the living room, the silence almost suffocating. He glanced down the hallway at the door to an empty room. It was open just a crack, but then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A long, unnaturally thin finger was wrapped around the edge of the door. Jacob screamed, pointing at the door in terror. His father immediately grabbed him, and they all rushed out of the house, not stopping until they reached a nearby gas station where they waited for Jacob's grandmother to arrive. Jacob later described the finger as looking almost like a foam finger in its length and width, but more sinister. It curled around the doorframe, the rest of the hand and the person it belonged to hidden from view. They didn't return to the house much after that, and when they did, it was only to pack up their belongings. Once they were out, they never went back. Nothing was stolen, but the window in that empty room was found open. Jacob still has nightmares about that finger, about what could have been hiding in that room, and about what might have happened if they had stayed. I was about 13 years old, and my bedroom was the most isolated room in our house. It was on a separate floor far from my parents' room, and that distance made me feel uneasy, especially at night. I had a wild imagination, which didn't help. I often found myself lying awake, scared and paranoid, staring into the darkness, unable to sleep. One night, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a stormy night, just a light rain tapping against the window. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. A strange feeling washed over me, a sense of discomfort that I couldn't explain. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something at the edge of my bed, a shadowy, roundish shape just over the headboard. My heart began to race, but then I realized it was just my hat. I had a habit of hanging my hat on one of the wooden poles at the end of my bed. I laughed at myself, feeling silly for being so scared, and I eventually fell back asleep. But it happened again about half an hour later. I woke up, saw the same shadowy figure, and felt the same rush of fear before remembering it was just my hat. This happened one more time that night, each time startling me awake before I could remind myself that it was nothing. At some point, I got thirsty and reached down to the side of my bed, searching for my water bottle. Instead, my hand touched something else, my hat. My heart dropped into my stomach as the realization hit me like a freight train. If my hat was in my hand, then what was at the end of my bed? I scrambled to turn on the lamp, nearly falling out of bed in my panic. When the light flooded the room, I saw him, a man, crouched at the foot of my bed, his face inches away from mine. He was staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I screamed louder than I ever had in my life and bolted past him, running down the stairs to my parents' room. I felt his hand brush against my arm as I fled, but I didn't stop. I woke my dad, who grabbed the bat from under his bed and raced back upstairs with me. But by the time we got there, the window was wide open, and the man was gone. He had jumped out onto the patio roof and disappeared into the night. I never saw him again, but I've never been able to sleep soundly since. If you've made it this far, you're 100% a horror fanatic, and we approve. If you love our campfire-themed horror storytelling experience, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our daily uploads. When I was a kid, my neighborhood was full of kids around my age, and we had a tight-knit group of friends. We would often play manhunt, a more grown-up version of hide and seek, on weekend nights. Since we all lived on the same block, we used all the front and back yards and even the woods behind our houses. We had one rule: no going more than a backyard's length into the woods. I always used the same hiding spot, a spot that had never failed me. There was an old, rusty barrel thrown into the woods years ago, and I would crouch behind it, staying perfectly still until the game was over. No one ever found me. On this particular night, there were only 6 of us playing. My friends Joe and Raj were on my team. As soon as the game started, we scattered, and I made a beeline for my usual hiding spot. It was a quiet night, unusually so, with no flashlights sweeping through the backyards or the woods like usual. I crouched behind the barrel, straining to hear any sign of the others. Then I heard footsteps nearby, but they weren't accompanied by the usual beam of a flashlight. I figured it was one of my teammates, so I whispered their names, Joe, Rage, but got no response. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, until they broke into a full sprint toward me. Panic surged through me as I jumped up and ran out of the woods, hoping to find a new hiding spot in my backyard. But when I turned around, there was no one there. My heart was pounding as I heard my friends calling my name from out front. I ran to meet them, only to find Joe's parents talking to my parents, with all my friends gathered around. My parents looked relieved to see me, but I was confused. They explained that a police officer had passed by and warned them about a serial rapist spotted in the area and that all the kids should stay indoors. I told them what had happened to me in the woods, how someone had charged at me, and my parents started to panic, questioning me over and over to make sure I wasn't making it up. They called the police, but I never found out if the person who chased me was ever caught. I try not to think about what could have happened if they had caught me, but the fear still lingers in the back of my mind. When I was about 12 or 13, my family and I, my mom's stepdad, and our 2 dogs went to the beach for a weekend. We rented a small apartment at the back of the shore, a cozy place with nothing particularly unusual about it at first glance. We unpacked our things and then went out for dinner, coming back around 9 p.m. After watching some TV for about an hour, we all settled down for the night. My mom and stepdad slept on a pull-out couch in the living room with the dogs, while they gave me the bedroom with the king-size bed. I stayed up late playing games on my computer, having pre-installed them since I knew there wouldn't be any internet connection. I finally decided to get some sleep after midnight. The room was silent, the only sound being the distant crashing of waves outside. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a loud, heavy sigh. It wasn't the kind of sound you could mistake for the wind or the house settling. It was distinctly human, and it came from inside the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew it wasn't my parents or the dogs. They were in the other room, with the door closed. I bolted out of bed and ran across the hallway to the smaller bedroom opposite mine, where I spent the rest of the night wide awake, terrified. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened, but they brushed it off as my imagination. But I knew what I had heard, and the memory of that sigh still haunts me to this day. A few years ago, I was staying with one of my best friends, Mike, in North Carolina. I had a job interview in the area, and since I was coming from New Jersey, Mike offered to let me crash at his place for a few days. He didn't live close to the company I was interviewing for, about 2 hours away, but I didn't mind the drive, and it was a good excuse to hang out with him. After my second interview, I came back to Mike's place in a great mood. I had been offered the job on the spot, so we celebrated that night in the yard with a few friends and more than a few beers. We stayed up late, getting more and more drunk as the night went on. People were coming and going all night, as Mike was the type to leave his door open and not really keep track of who was entering or leaving. By about 4 a.m., everyone had gone, and we decided to call it a night. I struggled to make it up the stairs to the bathroom, where I splashed some water on my face, trying to sober up. As I turned to the half-open door, I saw something that made my blood run cold, an eye peeking in at me through the crack. I let out a loud, panicked curse, and in my drunken state, stumbled and fell to the floor. When I got back up, the eye was gone. I stumbled out of the bathroom, calling Mike's name. He called back from downstairs in the kitchen, so it couldn't have been him. I brushed it off, convincing myself that I had just had too much to drink. I made it to the guest bedroom and collapsed onto the bed, pulling the covers over myself. I fell asleep almost immediately, as you do when you're drunk, but I didn't sleep for long. I woke up to an unbearable headache, rubbing my temples and groaning in pain. It was still dark, but I could tell it was close to sunrise. The room was chilly, and as I shifted under the covers, I felt something cold grab onto my foot. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I felt a hand stroking my foot. Then I heard a raspy voice whisper, "Can you help me?" I shot up in bed, screaming at the top of my lungs, before bolting out of the room and down the stairs. Mike met me at the top of the stairs, and I immediately called the police. It turned out that the intruder was a woman in her late 40s, clearly suffering from some kind of addiction. She had walked into Mike's house during the party and had been hiding in a closet. The eye I had seen in the bathroom was hers, peeking at me through the crack in the door. Ever since that night, I make sure to cover my feet with my sheets before I sleep. It was the dead of winter, and a few friends and I were on a skiing trip near South Lake Tahoe. We had rented a luxurious log cabin for a few nights, enjoying the snowy retreat. On the third night, a blizzard hit. and I woke up in the middle of the night, thirsty. I decided to get up and get a glass of water. As I crossed the cabin to the kitchen, I was startled by a frantic knock at the door. It was so late, and the storm outside was raging. I hesitated, thinking it might be better to ignore it, but then I realized they knew someone was inside. My car was parked right outside. I also worried that someone might be in trouble, caught in the dangerous weather. I tiptoed to the door and waited for another knock. It came again, louder and more desperate. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no answer. I called out again, louder this time, but still no response. The knocking stopped. My curiosity got the better of me, and I cracked the door open, keeping the chain lock on. There was no one there. I undid the lock and opened the door completely, stepping out into the snow. There were footprints leading away from the cabin, but they disappeared into the blizzard before I could follow them far. Something about the whole situation felt off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed help. So, against my better judgment, I slipped on my boots and jacket and followed the footprints into the storm. They led me to the edge of the property before they just stopped. There were no signs of a vehicle, no struggle, nothing. It was as if whoever had made the tracks had just vanished. I felt a cold dread wash over me and bolted back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. Before I could even catch my breath, the frantic knocking resumed. My heart pounded in my chest as I screamed for my friends, who all rushed downstairs to see what was wrong. We opened the door together, but there was no one there. The footprints were already filling in with snow, erasing any trace of the person who had knocked. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, but it still freaks me out every time I think about it. A few years ago, my friend and I were invited to a party a few hours out of town. We decided to stay in her family's holiday house about an hour south of the party location. It was winter, and the holiday town was completely deserted. When we arrived in the afternoon, there were no other cars on the street, and the whole area felt eerily empty. As we left for the party, I hesitated about whether to pull the gate all the way closed. I had trouble opening it earlier when we arrived, and I didn't want to be stuck outside if we came back late at night. But in the end, I decided to shut it for security. The party was great, and we didn't get back to the house until around 12:30 a.m. The moment we pulled up, I noticed that the gate was open. A chill ran down my spine because I knew I had closed it, and it couldn't have just blown open in the wind. I didn't want to scare my friend, so I was vague when she asked if I had shut it. We went inside, trying to shake off the unease, and decided to make a snack. As I was wandering through the house, my friend suddenly bolted from the kitchen and tackled me in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear. She was convinced she had heard someone walking around outside. We tried to calm ourselves down, but we had no cell reception, and there was no one else around. For the next half hour, we sat in the hallway, paralyzed with fear, listening to the sound of footsteps outside and the back door being jimmied. We decided we had to leave, so we grabbed our stuff and prepared to make a run for the car. Just as we were about to open the front door, there was a huge bang in the backyard, followed by the sound of birds screeching in the trees. We didn't wait to see what was causing it. We sprinted to the car, barely getting it started before peeling out of the driveway. As we reversed out, I saw someone running up the side of the house toward us. We sped all the way back to town and didn't sleep a wink that night. The next day, we decided it was better to leave and not come back. When I was 10, my family was doing some home renovations, and my parents were painting our bedrooms one weekend. Because of the smell and mess, we all had to sleep in the basement. There was a pull-out couch that turned into a bed, and my youngest brother Ben, who was only 1 at the time, had an extra crib down there. I was young, and sleeping in a pitch-dark basement was terrifying, but somehow having Ben down there with me made it a little less scary. He would often wake up in the middle of the night crying, and I'd get up to comfort him, which distracted me from my fear. But one night, I woke up to Ben screaming, not crying, but screaming like he was terrified. I was instantly on edge, and I ran over to his crib to see what was wrong. He was standing up, pointing at something in the darkness. I followed his gaze and saw that he was pointing into the pitch-black boiler room right next to his crib. A wave of dread washed over me, and I felt like 1,000 knives were stabbing into my chest. I could hear something faint, a sound like something falling over in the boiler room. The feeling that I was being watched was overwhelming. Without thinking, I grabbed Ben from his crib and ran upstairs as fast as I could. I never went back into that basement after that night, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was in that room with us.